the new God of faithfulness, the new gods of faithfulness, the new God of faithfulness, the new goddess of faithfulness, the new goddesses of faithfulness, the new goddess of faithfulness, the old God of faithfulness, the old gods of faithfulness, the old God of faithfulness, the old goddess of faithfulness, the old goddesses of faithfulness, the old goddess of faithfulness, the greater God of faithfulness, the greater gods of faithfulness, the greater God of faithfulness, the greater goddess of faithfulness, the greater goddesses of faithfulness, the greater goddess of faithfulness, the lesser God of faithfulness, the lesser gods of faithfulness, the lesser God of faithfulness, the lesser goddess of faithfulness, the lesser goddesses of faithfulness, the lesser goddess of faithfulness, the higher God of faithfulness, the higher gods of faithfulness, the higher God of faithfulness, the higher goddess of faithfulness, the higher goddesses of faithfulness, the higher goddess of faithfulness, the lower God of faithfulness, the lower gods of faithfulness, the lower God of faithfulness, the lower goddess of faithfulness, the lower goddesses of faithfulness, the lower goddess of faithfulness, the greater spirit of faithfulness, the greater spirits of faithfulness, the greater spirit of faithfulness, the lesser spirit of faithfulness, the lesser spirits of faithfulness, the lesser spirit of faithfulness, the higher spirit of faithfulness, the higher spirits of faithfulness, the higher spirit of faithfulness, the lower spirit of faithfulness, the lower spirits of faithfulness, the lower spirit of faithfulness, the major God of faithfulness, the major gods of faithfulness, the major God of faithfulness, the major goddess of faithfulness, the major goddesses of faithfulness, the major goddess of faithfulness, the minor God of faithfulness, the minor gods of faithfulness, the minor God of faithfulness, the minor goddess of faithfulness, the minor goddesses of faithfulness, the minor goddess of faithfulness, the superior God of faithfulness, the superior gods of faithfulness, the superior God of faithfulness, the superior goddess of faithfulness, the superior goddesses of faithfulness, the superior goddess of faithfulness, the inferior God of faithfulness, the inferior gods of faithfulness, the inferior God of faithfulness, the inferior goddess of faithfulness, the inferior goddesses of faithfulness, the inferior goddess of faithfulness, the ancestor God of faithfulness, the ancestor gods of faithfulness, the ancestor God of faithfulness, the ancestor goddess of faithfulness, the ancestor goddesses of faithfulness, the ancestor goddess of faithfulness, the ascendant God of faithfulness, the ascendant gods of faithfulness, the ascendant God of faithfulness, the ascendant goddess of faithfulness, the ascendant goddesses of faithfulness, the ascendant goddess of faithfulness, the descendant God of faithfulness, the descendant gods of faithfulness, the descendant God of faithfulness, the descendant goddess of faithfulness, the descendant goddesses of faithfulness, the descendant goddess of faithfulness, the transcendent God of faithfulness, the transcendent gods of faithfulness, the transcendent God of faithfulness, the transcendent goddess of faithfulness, the transcendent goddesses of faithfulness, the transcendent goddess of faithfulness, the past God of faithfulness, the past gods of faithfulness, the past God of faithfulness, the past goddess of faithfulness, the past goddesses of faithfulness, the past goddess of faithfulness, the present God of faithfulness, the present gods of faithfulness, the present God of faithfulness, the present goddess of faithfulness, the present goddesses of faithfulness, the present goddess of faithfulness, the future God of faithfulness, the future gods of faithfulness, the future God of faithfulness, the future goddess of faithfulness, the future goddesses of faithfulness, the future goddess of faithfulness, the authentic God of faithfulness, the authentic gods of faithfulness, the authentic God of faithfulness, the authentic goddess of faithfulness, the authentic goddesses of faithfulness, the authentic goddess of faithfulness, the synthetic god of faithfulness, the synthetic gods of faithfulness, the synthetic god of faithfulness, the synthetic goddess of faithfulness, the synthetic goddesses of faithfulness, the synthetic goddess of faithfulness, the progressive god of faithfulness, the progressive gods of faithfulness, the progressive god of faithfulness, the progressive goddess of faithfulness, the progressive goddesses of faithfulness, the progressive goddess of faithfulness, the regressive god of faithfulness, the regressive gods of faithfulness, the regressive god of faithfulness, the regressive goddess of faithfulness, the regressive goddesses of faithfulness, the regressive goddess of faithfulness, the ordinary god of faithfulness, the ordinary gods of faithfulness, the ordinary god of faithfulness, the ordinary goddess of faithfulness, the ordinary goddesses of faithfulness, the ordinary goddess of faithfulness, the extraordinary god of faithfulness, the extraordinary gods of faithfulness, the extraordinary god of faithfulness, the extraordinary goddess of faithfulness, the extraordinary goddesses of faithfulness, the extraordinary goddess of faithfulness, the static god of faithfulness, the static gods of faithfulness, the static god of faithfulness, the static goddess of faithfulness, the static goddesses of faithfulness, the static goddess of faithfulness, the dynamic god of faithfulness, the dynamic gods of faithfulness, the dynamic god of faithfulness, the dynamic goddess of faithfulness, the dynamic goddesses of faithfulness, the dynamic goddess of faithfulness, the land god of faithfulness, the land gods of faithfulness, the land god of faithfulness, the land goddess of faithfulness, the land goddesses of faithfulness, the land goddess of faithfulness, the sea god of faithfulness, the sea gods of faithfulness, the sea god of faithfulness, the sea goddess of faithfulness, the sea goddesses of faithfulness, the sea goddess of faithfulness, the sky god of faithfulness, the sky gods of faithfulness, the sky god of faithfulness, the sky goddess of faithfulness, the sky goddesses of faithfulness, the sky goddess of faithfulness, the god of faithfulness, the gods of faithfulness, the god of faithfulness, the goddess of faithfulness, the goddesses of faithfulness, the goddess of faithfulness, the half god of faithfulness, the half gods of faithfulness, the half god of faithfulness, the half goddess of faithfulness, the half goddesses of faithfulness, the half goddess of faithfulness, the vessel of faithfulness, the vessels of faithfulness, the vessel of faithfulness, the name of faithfulness, the names of faithfulness, the name of faithfulness, the person of faithfulness, the persons of faithfulness, the person of faithfulness, the persona of faithfulness, the personas of faithfulness, the persona of faithfulness, the personage of faithfulness, the personages of faithfulness, the personage of faithfulness, the personality of faithfulness, the personalities of faithfulness, the personality of faithfulness, the personification of faithfulness, the personifications of faithfulness, the personification of faithfulness, the image of faithfulness, the images of faithfulness, the image of faithfulness, the imagination of faithfulness, the imaginations of faithfulness, the imagination of faithfulness, the belief of faithfulness, the beliefs of faithfulness, the belief of faithfulness, the thought of faithfulness, the thoughts of faithfulness, the thought of faithfulness, the word of faithfulness, the words of faithfulness, the word of faithfulness, the action of faithfulness, the actions of faithfulness, the action of faithfulness, the reaction of faithfulness, the reactions of faithfulness, the reaction of faithfulness, the feeling of faithfulness, the feelings of faithfulness, the feeling of faithfulness, the situation of faithfulness, the situations of faithfulness, the situation of faithfulness, the circumstance of faithfulness, the circumstances of faithfulness, the circumstance of faithfulness, the environment of faithfulness, the environments of faithfulness, the environment of faithfulness, the relationship of faithfulness, the relationships of faithfulness, the relationship of faithfulness, the number of faithfulness, the numbers of faithfulness, the number of faithfulness, the formula of faithfulness, the formulas of faithfulness, the formula of faithfulness, the equation of faithfulness, the equations of faithfulness, the equation of faithfulness, the theory of faithfulness, the theories of faithfulness, the theory of faithfulness, the symbol of faithfulness, the symbols of faithfulness, the symbol of faithfulness, the color of faithfulness, the colors of faithfulness, the color of faithfulness, the thing of faithfulness, the things of faithfulness, the thing of faithfulness, the way of faithfulness, the ways of faithfulness, the way of faithfulness, the place of faithfulness, the places of faithfulness, the place of faithfulness, the time of faithfulness, the times of faithfulness, the time of faithfulness, the event of faithfulness, the events of faithfulness, the event of faithfulness, the result of faithfulness, the results of faithfulness, the result of faithfulness, the crown of faithfulness, the crowns of faithfulness, the crown of faithfulness, the throne of faithfulness, the thrones of faithfulness, the throne of faithfulness, the faithfulness king, the faithfulness kings, the faithfulness kingdom, the faithfulness kingdoms, the faithfulness king's subject, the faithfulness king's subjects, the faithfulness king's dominion, the faithfulness king's dominions, the kingdom of faithfulness, the kingdoms of faithfulness, the kingdom of faithfulness, the faithfulness queen, the faithfulness queens, the faithfulness queendom, the faithfulness queendoms, the faithfulness queen subject, the faithfulness queen subjects, the faithfulness queen's dominion, the faithfulness queen's dominions, the queendom of faithfulness, the queendoms of faithfulness, the queendom of faithfulness, the faithfulness prince, the faithfulness princes, the faithfulness princedom, the faithfulness princedoms, the faithfulness prince's subject, the faithfulness prince's subjects, the faithfulness prince's dominion, the faithfulness prince's dominions, the princedom of faithfulness, the princedoms of faithfulness, the princedom of faithfulness, the faithfulness princess, the faithfulness princesses, the faithfulness princessdom, the faithfulness princessdoms, the faithfulness princess's subject, the faithfulness princess's subjects, the faithfulness princess's dominion, the faithfulness princess's dominions, the princessdom of faithfulness, the princessdoms of faithfulness, the princessdom of faithfulness, the Lord of faithfulness, the lords of faithfulness, the Lord of faithfulness, the Lordess of faithfulness, the Lordesses of faithfulness, the Lordess of faithfulness, the priest of faithfulness, the priests of faithfulness, the priest of faithfulness, the priestess of faithfulness, the priestesses of faithfulness, the priestess of faithfulness, the ritual of faithfulness, the rituals of faithfulness, the ritual of faithfulness, the shrine of faithfulness, the shrines of faithfulness, the shrine of faithfulness, the temple of faithfulness, the temples of faithfulness, the temple of faithfulness, the leader of faithfulness, the leaders of faithfulness, the leader of faithfulness, the follower of faithfulness, the followers of faithfulness, the follower of faithfulness, the natural substance of faithfulness, the natural substances of faithfulness, the natural substance of faithfulness, the supernatural substance of faithfulness, the supernatural substances of faithfulness, the supernatural substance of faithfulness, the temporal substance of faithfulness, the temporal substances of faithfulness, the temporal substance of faithfulness, the spiritual substance of faithfulness, the spiritual substances of faithfulness, the spiritual substance of faithfulness, the natural form of faithfulness, the natural forms of faithfulness, the natural form of faithfulness, the supernatural form of faithfulness, the supernatural forms of faithfulness, the supernatural form of faithfulness, the temporal form of faithfulness, the temporal forms of faithfulness, the temporal form of faithfulness, the spiritual form of faithfulness, the spiritual forms of faithfulness, the spiritual form of faithfulness, the age of faithfulness, the ages of faithfulness, the age of faithfulness, the era of faithfulness, the eras of faithfulness, the era of faithfulness, the awakener of faithfulness, the awakeners of faithfulness, the awakener of faithfulness, the awakening of faithfulness, the awakenings of faithfulness, the awakening of faithfulness, the realm of faithfulness, the realms of faithfulness, the realm of faithfulness, the dimension of faithfulness, the dimensions of faithfulness, the dimension of faithfulness, the zone of faithfulness, the zones of faithfulness, the zone of faithfulness, the frequency of faithfulness, the frequencies of faithfulness, the frequency of faithfulness, the century of faithfulness, the centuries of faithfulness, the century of faithfulness, the millennium of faithfulness, the millenniums of faithfulness, the millennium of faithfulness, the purpose of faithfulness, the purposes of faithfulness, the purpose of faithfulness, the meaning of faithfulness, the meanings of faithfulness, the meaning of faithfulness, the culture of faithfulness, the cultures of faithfulness, the culture of faithfulness, the demonstrator of faithfulness, the demonstrators of faithfulness, the demonstrator of faithfulness, the demonstration of faithfulness, the demonstrations of faithfulness, the demonstration of faithfulness, the manifester of faithfulness, the manifestors of faithfulness, the manifester of faithfulness, the manifestation of faithfulness, the manifestations of faithfulness, the manifestation of faithfulness, the presence of faithfulness, the presences of faithfulness, the presence of faithfulness, the glow of faithfulness, the glows of faithfulness, the glow of faithfulness, the goal of faithfulness, the goals of faithfulness, the goal of faithfulness, the plan of faithfulness, the plans of faithfulness, the plan of faithfulness, the book of faithfulness, the books of faithfulness, the book of faithfulness, the philosopher of faithfulness, the philosophers of faithfulness, the philosopher of faithfulness, the philosophy of faithfulness, the philosophies of faithfulness, the philosophy of faithfulness, the releaser of faithfulness, the releasers of faithfulness, the releaser of faithfulness, the release of faithfulness, the releases of faithfulness, the release of faithfulness, the variable of faithfulness, the variables of faithfulness, the variable of faithfulness, the cause of faithfulness, the causes of faithfulness, the cause of faithfulness, the effect of faithfulness, the effects of faithfulness, the effect of faithfulness, the journey of faithfulness, the journeys of faithfulness, the journey of faithfulness, the emergence of faithfulness, the emergences of faithfulness, the emergence of faithfulness, the source of faithfulness, the sources of faithfulness, the source of faithfulness, the originator of faithfulness, the originators of faithfulness, the originator of faithfulness, the origin of faithfulness, the origins of faithfulness, the origin of faithfulness, the forefather of faithfulness, the forefathers of faithfulness, the forefather of faithfulness, the foremother of faithfulness, the foremothers of faithfulness, the foremother of faithfulness, the ancestor of faithfulness, the ancestors of faithfulness, the ancestor of faithfulness, the descendant of faithfulness, the descendants of faithfulness, the descendant of faithfulness, the lineage of faithfulness, the lineages of faithfulness, the lineage of faithfulness, the heritage of faithfulness, the heritages of faithfulness, the heritage of faithfulness, the heir of faithfulness, the heirs of faithfulness, the heir of faithfulness, the co-heir of faithfulness, the co-heirs of faithfulness, the co-heir of faithfulness, the joint heir of faithfulness, the joint heirs of faithfulness, the joint heir of faithfulness, the dynasty of faithfulness, the dynasties of faithfulness, the dynasty of faithfulness, the force of faithfulness, the forces of faithfulness, the force of faithfulness, the law of faithfulness, the laws of faithfulness, the law of faithfulness, the pact of faithfulness, the pacts of faithfulness, the pact of faithfulness, the game of faithfulness, the games of faithfulness, the game of faithfulness, the mask of faithfulness, the masks of faithfulness, the mask of faithfulness, the armor of faithfulness, the armors of faithfulness, the armor of faithfulness, the sword of faithfulness, the swords of faithfulness, the sword of faithfulness, the shield of faithfulness, the shields of faithfulness, the shield of faithfulness, the force shield of faithfulness, the force shields of faithfulness, the force shield of faithfulness, the armored force shield of faithfulness, the armored force shields of faithfulness, the armored force shield of faithfulness, the champion of faithfulness, the champions of faithfulness, the champion of faithfulness, the guardian of faithfulness, the guardians of faithfulness, the guardian of faithfulness, the defender of faithfulness, the defenders of faithfulness, the defender of faithfulness, the protector of faithfulness, the protectors of faithfulness, the protector of faithfulness, the chant of faithfulness, the chants of faithfulness, the chant of faithfulness, the shape of faithfulness, the shapes of faithfulness, the shape of faithfulness, the cube of faithfulness, the cubes of faithfulness, the cube of faithfulness, the cuboid of faithfulness, the cuboids of faithfulness, the cuboid of faithfulness, the sphere of faithfulness, the spheres of faithfulness, the sphere of faithfulness, the spheroid of faithfulness, the spheroids of faithfulness, the spheroid of faithfulness, the prism of faithfulness, the prisms of faithfulness, the prism of faithfulness, the pyramid of faithfulness, the pyramids of faithfulness, the pyramid of faithfulness, the cylinder of faithfulness, the cylinders of faithfulness, the cylinder of faithfulness, the cone of faithfulness, the cones of faithfulness, the cone of faithfulness, the triangle of faithfulness, the triangles of faithfulness, the triangle of faithfulness, the circle of faithfulness, the circles of faithfulness, the circle of faithfulness, the semicircle of faithfulness, the semicircles of faithfulness, the semicircle of faithfulness, the square of faithfulness, the squares of faithfulness, the square of faithfulness, the rectangle of faithfulness, the rectangles of faithfulness, the rectangle of faithfulness, the parallelogram of faithfulness, the parallelograms of faithfulness, the parallelogram of faithfulness, the rhombus of faithfulness, the rhombuses of faithfulness, the rhombus of faithfulness, the trapezoid of faithfulness, the trapezoids of faithfulness, the trapezoid of faithfulness, the polygon of faithfulness, the polygons of faithfulness, the polygon of faithfulness, the pentagon of faithfulness, the pentagons of faithfulness, the pentagon of faithfulness, the hexagon of faithfulness, the hexagons of faithfulness, the hexagon of faithfulness, the septagon of faithfulness, the septagons of faithfulness, the septagon of faithfulness, the octagon of faithfulness, the octagons of faithfulness, the octagon of faithfulness, the nonagon of faithfulness, the nonagons of faithfulness, the nonagon of faithfulness, the decagon of faithfulness, the decagons of faithfulness, the decagon of faithfulness, the evolution of faithfulness, the evolutions of faithfulness, the evolution of faithfulness, the revolution of faithfulness, the revolutions of faithfulness, the revolution of faithfulness, the elemental art of faithfulness, the elemental arts of faithfulness, the elemental art of faithfulness, the elemental science of faithfulness, the elemental sciences of faithfulness, the elemental science of faithfulness, the elemental principle of faithfulness, the elemental principles of faithfulness, the elemental principle of faithfulness, the elemental technology of faithfulness, the elemental technologies of faithfulness, the elemental technology of faithfulness, the low elemental art of faithfulness, the low elemental arts of faithfulness, the low elemental art of faithfulness, the low elemental science of faithfulness, the low elemental sciences of faithfulness, the low elemental science of faithfulness, the low elemental principle of faithfulness, the low elemental principles of faithfulness, the low elemental principle of faithfulness, the low elemental technology of faithfulness, the low elemental technologies of faithfulness, the low elemental technology of faithfulness, the high elemental art of faithfulness, the high elemental arts of faithfulness, the high elemental art of faithfulness, the high elemental science of faithfulness, the high elemental sciences of faithfulness, the high elemental science of faithfulness, the high elemental principle of faithfulness, the high elemental principles of faithfulness, the high elemental principle of faithfulness, the high elemental technology of faithfulness, the high elemental technologies of faithfulness, the high elemental technology of faithfulness, the agent of faithfulness, the agents of faithfulness, the agent of faithfulness, the agency of faithfulness, the agencies of faithfulness, the agency of faithfulness, the amplifier of faithfulness, the amplifiers of faithfulness, the amplifier of faithfulness, the amplification of faithfulness, the amplifications of faithfulness, the amplification of faithfulness, the enhancer of faithfulness, the enhancers of faithfulness, the enhancer of faithfulness, the enhancement of faithfulness, the enhancements of faithfulness, the enhancement of faithfulness, the magnifier of faithfulness, the magnifiers of faithfulness, the magnifier of faithfulness, the magnification of faithfulness, the magnifications of faithfulness, the magnification of faithfulness, the influencer of faithfulness, the influencers of faithfulness, the influencer of faithfulness, the influence of faithfulness, the influences of faithfulness, the influence of faithfulness, the emanator of faithfulness, the emanators of faithfulness, the emanator of faithfulness, the emanation of faithfulness, the emanations of faithfulness, the emanation of faithfulness, the converger of faithfulness, the convergers of faithfulness, the converger of faithfulness, the convergence of faithfulness, the convergences of faithfulness, the convergence of faithfulness, the aura of faithfulness, the auras of faithfulness, the aura of faithfulness, the impression of faithfulness, the impressions of faithfulness, the impression of faithfulness, the intelligence of faithfulness, the intelligences of faithfulness, the intelligence of faithfulness, the sophistication of faithfulness, the sophistications of faithfulness, the sophistication of faithfulness, the genius of faithfulness, the geniuses of faithfulness, the genius of faithfulness, the polymath of faithfulness, the polymaths of faithfulness, the polymath of faithfulness, the psychic of faithfulness, the psychics of faithfulness, the psychic of faithfulness, the knowledge of faithfulness, the knowledges of faithfulness, the knowledge of faithfulness, the understanding of faithfulness, the understandings of faithfulness, the understanding of faithfulness, the wisdom of faithfulness, the wisdoms of faithfulness, the wisdom of faithfulness, the secret of faithfulness, the secrets of faithfulness, the secret of faithfulness, the mystery of faithfulness, the mysteries of faithfulness, the mystery of faithfulness, the revelation of faithfulness, the revelations of faithfulness, the revelation of faithfulness, the tactic of faithfulness, the tactics of faithfulness, the tactic of faithfulness, the strategy of faithfulness, the strategies of faithfulness, the strategy of faithfulness, the strength of faithfulness, the strengths of faithfulness, the strength of faithfulness, the might of faithfulness, the mights of faithfulness, the might of faithfulness, the power of faithfulness, the powers of faithfulness, the power of faithfulness, the authority of faithfulness, the authorities of faithfulness, the authority of faithfulness, the dominion of faithfulness, the dominions of faithfulness, the dominion of faithfulness, the rhythm of faithfulness, the rhythms of faithfulness, the rhythm of faithfulness, the melody of faithfulness, the melodies of faithfulness, the melody of faithfulness, the music of faithfulness, the musics of faithfulness, the music of faithfulness, the lyric of faithfulness, the lyrics of faithfulness, the lyric of faithfulness, the song of faithfulness, the songs of faithfulness, the song of faithfulness, the dance of faithfulness, the dances of faithfulness, the dance of faithfulness, the spirit of faithfulness, the spirits of faithfulness, the spirit of faithfulness, the soul of faithfulness, the souls of faithfulness, the soul of faithfulness, the body of faithfulness, the bodies of faithfulness, the body of faithfulness, the mark of faithfulness, the marks of faithfulness, the mark of faithfulness, the promise of faithfulness, the promises of faithfulness, the promise of faithfulness, the visionary of faithfulness, the visionaries of faithfulness, the visionary of faithfulness, the vision of faithfulness, the visions of faithfulness, the vision of faithfulness, the picture of faithfulness, the pictures of faithfulness, the picture of faithfulness, the sound of faithfulness, the sounds of faithfulness, the sound of faithfulness, the dung of faithfulness, the dungs of faithfulness, the dung of faithfulness, the language of faithfulness, the languages of faithfulness, the language of faithfulness, the communication of faithfulness, the communications of faithfulness, the communication of faithfulness, the people of faithfulness, the peoples of faithfulness, the people of faithfulness, the society of faithfulness, the societies of faithfulness, the society of faithfulness, the fortress of faithfulness, the fortresses of faithfulness, the fortress of faithfulness, the government of faithfulness, the governments of faithfulness, the government of faithfulness, the city of faithfulness, the cities of faithfulness, the city of faithfulness, the nation of faithfulness, the nations of faithfulness, the nation of faithfulness, the civilization of faithfulness, the civilizations of faithfulness, the civilization of faithfulness, the world of faithfulness, the worlds of faithfulness, the world of faithfulness,